there's about a 1 in 3 chance of a major global conflict, so something as large as the previous 2 world wars, in the next kind of 10 years or so. Russia is only able to continue this war because China backs it. Hi, I'm Pete Apps. I'm a global defense columnist for Reuters. I'm a British Army specialist reservist. I'm the author of a book called The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict and the Fight to Stop It. And I also present a podcast for the British Army.
Last month, Putin suffered his highest casualties with 40,000, including 26,000 fatalities. Why is he willing to burn through human lives at the highest rate of the entire war?
So I think, the most obvious reason is just the lack of another plan. So, this was not what Putin wanted to do any more than the generals of the First World War wanted to keep throwing away, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives on the Western Front. Putin got into a war that he thought would be over in 3 days. But having got stuck into that war, he has proved willing so far to throw ever larger numbers of Russian soldiers into that conflict. There's 500,000 dead so far, in the hope that he'll be able to keep moving forward, keep taking ground, and eventually get a peace that he can claim as victory, whatever that looks like. And the Ukrainians, who also have a more serious shortage of people than Russia, the Ukrainian population is a lot smaller, are doing everything they can to kill as many Russians as possible, because the Ukrainian plan, and Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has talked about this quite a lot publicly, is to impose such high casualties on Russia for such low rewards, in other words, to slow Russia's advance or stop it, that Russia has to come up with another solution and ideally stop attacking and do something else.
What do you think he may do instead of this?
Well, in the short term, I think he's going to keep doing the same thing. I think, we're midway through the summer fighting season, and I suspect that season will run through. And then so I think, broadly speaking, this will continue. Exactly what the Russians do will change, right? So the exact tactics the Russians have used have evolved really very considerably over 4 years of the war. So if you think of the first weeks of the war, sort of long columns of armored vehicles heading towards Kyiv. Now we're talking about lots of drones. We're talking about very small sort of breakout groups. The Russians have tried lots of ways of breaking through so far that haven't worked, and I'm sure they have 3 or 4 plans that they hope will. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians talk about, doing a massive drone offensive at some point. So you literally take you build up a huge stockpile of drones, and you use them to try and break through the front in the same way that we would once use tanks or people or cavalry. They will keep trying to find new ways of doing things. They will keep trying to find new ways of cutting off each other's drones, whether that is jamming or striking logistics centers, all that kind of thing. But the truth is, I suspect the Russians will get through this summer and then will attempt to inflict another very difficult winter on Ukraine. So both Russia and Ukraine are adopting different but overlapping strategies at the moment with their medium and long range strikes, which is to try and inflict as much damage as possible on essential infrastructure in those countries. So in the case of Russia, the Ukrainians have gone after refineries. In the case of Ukraine, the Russians have gone after power generation. And again, they're particularly looking to try and inflict an even more unpleasant winter on Ukraine than they managed last year. Last year was really challenging. And it's also, both of these are political, right? So the Ukrainians want to put pressure on Putin politically, and Putin wants to put pressure on Zelenskyy politically. Zelensky's not as popular as he was. There's talk of maybe an election at some point, difficult to do in a time of war. Valery Zaluzhny, the former military chief, now the ambassador to London, is supposed to have told Zelenskyy that he will go back and contest those elections when they happen. So, the Russians are hoping that the wheels come off Zelensky's government. Zelenskyy is hoping the wheels come off Putin's government. And in the meantime, they are both looking for new ways to secure battlefield advantage.
We saw Putin make a rare admission of problems in terms of fuel shortages and air defences. And there's reports that he pulled air defences back to Moscow and the Kerch Bridge. Do you think Ukraine has an advantage there now in terms of aerial strikes?
It depends what you mean, right? So, the Ukrainians have effectively, they've struck at Moscow. You'll have seen that oil refinery blowing up in Moscow. They hit a Russian frigate in a dry dock in St. Petersburg on June the 3rd. So that's only 250 kilometers from NATO territory, a very long way from Ukrainian territory. And you see video of drones and missiles slamming into places, including their Flamingo sort of long-range missile, which is, someone says it's about as stealthy as a Zeppelin. So that implies the Russians have a limited amount of air defenses, and it implies that they're struggling to know where to put it. Having said that, it is more unpleasant living in Kyiv than it is living in Moscow. So, if you look at the number of strikes every night, Moscow is not being subjected to the kind of strikes that Kyiv is. And you're also looking at very different ecosystems of air defense. So Ukraine, although obviously the exact details of this are kept very deliberately under wraps, is still chewing up quite a lot of high-end Western air defense, PAC-3 Patriot missiles and so forth. They're trying to drive down the cost of that. But you've got the whole of Europe trying to build air defense missiles, both for themselves and for Ukraine. And to a lesser extent, the Americans part of that effort. Russian air defense is obviously a bit different. Again, you've probably got some direct support from China in there, certainly in the form of components, possibly in the form of collaboration. But Russia is huge. As is Ukraine. So you can defend some fixed points, like Kyiv and like Moscow up to a point. But there's always somewhere else you can strike. In that sense, and don't forget, they both also have access to varying forms of data collection. So the Russians will be hacking into Ukrainian systems, hacking into Western systems, trying to work out where the supply dumps are, everything else. Obviously, both sides have access to commercial satellite footage, almost certainly. We know that the Ukrainians do. Quite likely the Russians are finding ways to buy stuff off open source satellites, so they're looking at Ukraine. So they both have access to huge amounts of information about what's going on. And then they are choosing where to use their limited but quite large resources to strike.
Just how sustainable is this meat grinder strategy for Russia? Is Putin running on borrowed time? It seems like Ukraine have really got a grasp and a grip on this drone warfare element. Is there going to come a point where they'll say no more?
Well, Russia could do what Ukraine is doing and stop sending people forward to attack in quite such large numbers. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, the only reason he lost so many people this month is he's still trying to take terrain. If he decides to hold back on that, then, he'll lose fewer people. And he's got enough drones to stop the Ukrainians breaking through. So, it's far from impossible to imagine the next summer Russia has dialed back its casualties considerably, but the front line still look like the front line. And it's still very difficult for you. If you think about, most Ukrainian soldiers aren't being killed by those Russian soldiers who are attacking, right? They're being killed by Russian drones. So ironically, it's not unlike, we're doing this in July. It's not unlike the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Britain lost 60,000 men on the first day of the Somme and achieved very little. The war wouldn't have stopped if we just hadn't done the Somme. We could have kept those men back home, tried to find another solution, which in our case was inventing tanks, which went into action for the first time in 1917. So, if Putin decides he's losing too many people, he will stop losing as many people because he can afford to cut back on that. And so, he could sue for peace because he doesn't want to break this, but he could just keep the war going. And, Rob Bauer, who was the former head of the military committee at NATO, gave an interview about a week ago, Russia is only able to continue this war because China backs it, and Ukraine is only able to continue this war because it's backed by Europe. And the truth is that you just need to kind of the truth is that this war could continue at a lower level of intensity forever if no one can find a way to stop it. So we could continue to have these kind of sort of strikes on cities in Ukraine. The Ukrainians believe that they have dialed back their number of casualties to a borderline sustainable level. So they're using robots. They're now talking about using mercenaries. We know the Russians are doing the same. This war could stop quite soon if people decided they wanted to. Or we could still be doing this in 2030, probably without the same number of Russian casualties, probably with things continuing to blow up, and probably with ongoing, attacks in the West. So, we just saw, Royal Air Service Institute just suggesting that Russia was flying drones over UK, US air bases, from a ship sometime about a year ago. The Russians paid someone to set light to Keir Starmer's front door in Kentish Town. I mean, that's a fairly punchy kind of attack. I mean, albeit kind of deliberately kind of sort of dialed back. And as the polls say, they've got constant sabotage on their railway system. Someone burnt down a shopping centre. The left and right of we could still be doing this in 2020, even if there's a ceasefire, we're probably doing a bit of it. By the same token, at some stage, either the Russians or the Ukrainians might find something that they believe works again, in the way of unmanned systems attacks and achieve some kind of breakthrough.
Looking at the territorial gains, Russia only advanced an average of 3.79 square kilometres per day in June. Back in August last year, they were taking over 16 square kilometres a day. Why has Putin's war machine slowed, and why is the Kremlin spinning this as a massive victory when the data is telling the total opposite?
Well, it's not the total opposite, because if you look at firstly, the data is hard to interpret, because if you actually look at the front line, the kind of, the zone of no one being in control is fairly huge. It's about sort of 20, 30 miles wide. So, a lot of the ground being taken by either side is pretty small slivers within that. But according to the Institute of Study of War, which is generally regarded as the leading open source, Russia lost ground in April and May. And, we're only on July the 2nd, but it begins to look like they took ground in June. Now, an incredibly small amount of ground. I mean, we're probably talking about an area, potentially smaller than Hyde Park. Maybe a bit bigger, but we're not talking about huge areas. We're talking about, dozens of square kilometers. Nevertheless, in the Donbass, which is the bit that the Russians care about, essentially the Donbass that you've got Donetsk and Luhansk, that is where the Russians they want all of those provinces, and they control, I think, about 2/3 of each of them. They are moving forward in those areas, and as long as they are moving forward in those areas, they may keep the war going. Now, the Ukrainians were pushing back on some other fronts, particularly around Zaporizhzhia, which is down where that nuclear power station is, a bit further south. Really important area for the Ukrainian sort of origin of Ukrainian Cossack culture comes from around there. But the Russians took more terrain than the Ukrainians did this month. If this war is going to continue for a very long time, the Russians may be able to live with that. And if they can dial down their casualties, this is a data-driven war, right? So if you look at the Ukrainians, Mikhail Fedorov, who was the Ukrainian defense minister, gave a presentation remotely to a conference in London last week. The Ukrainians basically run a spreadsheet war. They look at what works, which drones work, which units work, and they reinforce success. What that also means, of course, no one talks about it, is they look at where their casualties are and they try and dial them down. And presumably the Russians are doing the same. So, what the Russians will be doing is looking at, right, if those numbers are correct, and, they're probably an overstatement because they come from the Ukrainian side, sort of rule of thumb, RAF came to shoot down 2,000 aircraft in the Battle of Britain. The Germans only lost 600. So, you've always got a degree of fudge. But the Russians will know how many they lost, and they'll know exactly how they lost them. And, someone in a box somewhere in Moscow is probably coming up with a plan to not lose those people. And they will also be looking at where they took that territory. And what we don't know for sure, but the Russians will, because they'll have more data on their own performance than anyone else will, and the Ukrainians will probably have a good idea, is whether where they took the ground is where they lost all those people. And then they will re-engineer it and try and work out a slightly better way of doing it. And the Russians, as by tradition, don't mind taking enormous casualties, but they do also adapt. And so they'll be looking at what worked, and probably, because this is just the nature of warfare, and it has been for 1,000 years, and it's now a lot easier to track down, somewhere in that data will be something new the Russians did that worked. And they will notice that. They will hope the Ukrainians haven't noticed it, because obviously if the Ukrainians have noticed it, they'll start to prepare against it. And then they will build up something to do it. That's what the Ukrainians did in Kursk. It's the nature of things. But, and again, we know the Russians are working with the Chinese up to a point. We know, obviously, that the Ukrainians are working with the Brits and the Americans and everyone else. So, all of that is going on just as the Iranians and the Israelis and the Gulfies are looking at where their vulnerabilities are, looking at what they can protect. In the case of the Europeans and the Americans, they're then trying to extrapolate that data in case they have to fight a big war in the future. So, don't underestimate that this is a complex game, and the Russians probably will do something slightly different next month to what they did this month. And they've still got, several months of the summer. And again, if they believe they're wearing down Zelenskyy politically, then, it's worth pushing through for another bit.
We saw a former high-ranking Ukrainian intelligence official has been sentenced to life in prison for spying for Russia, for Russia's FSB. Is that a worrying sign for Ukraine? How deep are Russia into their security networks?
I mean, as of about 2014, the penetration was regarded as being nearly total. So when Russia first annexed Crimea in 2014, the fear amongst younger, sort of more pro-Ukraine officers in the military was that the entire security infrastructure was penetrated by Russia. And there's probably quite a lot of evidence for that. What you then saw was Ukraine's military intelligence comprehensively rewire itself between 2014 and 2022, primarily through bringing people who'd been born after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but who were young. And Ukrainian military intelligence rebooted itself first. Civilian intelligence agencies still heavily penetrated. A lot of people tried to go over to Russia in the first days of the invasion in 2022. And since then, you've seen a fight. I mean, the bottom line is some Russians secretly work for Ukraine, some Ukrainians secretly work for Russia. And when one side gets caught by the other, they tend to be, it's bloody unpleasant. You get tortured to death. These people walk both sides of the lines. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Is it getting worse or better? I think probably Ukraine is getting better at sort of, at cracking down on these networks. But it's like the drone war. It's a two-way street. And again, I mean, this is all of these dynamics we're talking about are also true, for example, of Israel, Iran. So there are definitely some people in the Iranian government who are working for the Israelis. I think less likely the other way around, but certainly, you've certainly got, people, the Israelis are very worried about people looking at them from Lebanon and the Gaza Strip and everything else, and the Palestinian territories who might have a dotted line to Tehran. And once again, in both of those cases and the Gulf states, you're seeing people throwing missiles at each other sometimes holding back, sometimes eyeing up that critical infrastructure, particularly if you look at the Gulf states and Iran. Firing missiles at each other, yes, but also real worries on the Gulf state side that if this escalated too far, that Iran would strike the desalination plants and the power plants to keep the air conditioning on and keep water for the Gulf. Not just important for people, but important for data centers. So, I would say in both the Gulf and Ukraine, we're seeing this not quite no-holds-barred war, because the Russians could fire cruise missiles into Ukraine's nuclear power stations tomorrow, and the Ukrainians could do the same with the Russians. And that would be a massive escalation, might even lead to nuclear war. Incredibly unlikely that either side is prepared to do that for just that reason. So, you're seeing this kind of limited war going on, holding back sometimes leading in. Sometimes people, some people involved, particularly the people who are sort of betraying their countries on either side in the middle, as people would look at it, paying the highest price. Bad news if you live in Kyiv, not great news if you live in Moscow, but a really interesting confrontation that looks like it's going on for 4 years already, longer than the First World War. And even if these wars stop, so even if there's a successful ceasefire in the Gulf, even if there's a successful ceasefire in Ukraine, we're now so entrenched in these confrontations that almost everyone involved believes they'll be doing it again at some point.
I want to talk about NATO now. In your book, Deterring, Armageddon, that you wrote, can NATO actually stop Putin, or are we just reacting to him?
I mean, so the first big and obvious answer is yes. So NATO nations, including the United States, population of 1 billion people. So you're talking about, you're talking about a superpower that is India-sized, almost in its population, almost China-sized population, but incredibly richer. So, if your question is, can the Russians invade NATO and win a long war against all those countries together, the answer is no. The answer is also no, even if America pulls out. So can Russia win a long war of national survival against the nations of the European Union where they're all on one side together? No. Can NATO stop Russia taking the least defended piece of territory that Russia can find? In other words, if Russia can find a weak spot on the eastern flank, can Russia seize that? Probably. Can they hold it for a bit? It depends what comes back the other way. And then you get to the question that you're really asking, which is NATO politically strong enough to be able to deploy that industrial, economic, and military force in a way that keeps Russia deterred? To which I think the broader answer is also yes. But as always with NATO, there are quite a lot of buts to it. So we're about to run into the Ankara summit next week. Annual summit, all the leaders will come together. In the first couple of years after the invasion of Ukraine, these were sort of signs of the alliance working together. The Biden administration will make a huge point of making clear that it backed these big defense plans that NATO was drawing up, and those NATO defense plans involved using American troops and American technology and German industry and all the sort of might of all of those guys together to push back against any Russian invasion. The last few months have been really complicated on that front. Row between the US and Europe over Iran, use of European bases, America talking about NATO being a paper tiger. Actually, a lot of European rearmament led by Germany and Poland, but not exclusively. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, talks of the Trump trillion, which is $1 trillion more being spent on defense since Trump was first president in 2017 by European nations. Is that because of Trump? It's because of Trump a bit, but mainly it's because of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. European nations don't want to be invaded. The closer they are to Ukraine and Russia, the more money they're prepared to spend, as a general rule of thumb. So NATO is quite, on paper, NATO is strong. In practice, the US has just said it's going to pull out a bunch of troops. Trump has just fired Chris Donahue, who's not quite the functional number 2 US officer in Europe, but the head of US land forces in Europe, also the head of NATO land force in a war, the principal designer of those war plans, particularly the high-tech stuff, the AI targeting the long-range strike, fired by Trump only a couple of weeks ago. So real questions over, how much the US does. Is the US still going to be in charge? How much of the US forces are there? Germany really stepping up. Saw the head of the German army speak last week, really impressive. We're seeing an evolution from NATO 1.0, which was the NATO of the Cold War, where an American-led NATO was designed to try and hold the Soviet Union for 2 weeks and then go nuclear, and that was designed to be enough to deter a war. Then we saw what people now refer to as NATO 2. Russia vanished. NATO goes off and does stuff in Afghanistan, and now what the Americans want to call NATO 3 or 3.0, which is a NATO prepared to hold Russia but with more European force. And the truth is that is coming into existence. I mean, that does exist in a way it didn't in 2022. The issue is how much it holds together, and are there any sort of slivers in it that Putin thinks he can kind of take advantage of without getting a very bloody nose. And every 6 months, the Germans, the Poles, and everyone else are buying more kit, particularly long-range missiles and so forth, that would inflict more damage on Russia if it did attempt to cross that threshold.
Peter, in your newest book, you warned that we are entering a new age of global conflict. Are we already living through the opening chapters of World War III?
So I think we're certainly entering a dangerous new era of conflict, and we've seen that in what's happened in the Gulf since the book came out. So the book came out at the beginning of January, and obviously, within about sort of a few weeks of that, we saw Operation Epic Fury, Trump's attack against Iran. As to whether we're in the foothills of World War III, only historians will be able to judge. My assessment, and it's still more or less where it was at the beginning of the year, is that there's about a 1 in 3 chance of a major global conflict, so something as large as the previous 2 world wars, in the next kind of 10 years or so. What we are definitely in an era of, however, is mounting international confrontation. So, the comparisons it might be like the 1930s or the 1910s that led up to the previous World War, might be more akin to the early 1950s, so late 1940s, early 1950s, which were the beginning of the last Cold War, where you saw tensions rising every year, and then they plateaued, and we ended up in a confrontation with the Soviet Union that was very messy, saw very real wars, Vietnam, really big wars in the developing world, but never quite went over the edge. And the simple truth is that we can't know that now. And only historians will be able to judge.